If I could choose only 3 foods to survive through a long-term crisis, I would throw away almost everything else and keep only these 3 items. Not because they taste the best, but because millions of families have survived on foods like these for hundreds of years. The frightening part is that most people today are stockpiling the wrong way. They buy many things that seem useful, yet they are missing the 3 things that matter most: energy to keep the body functioning, protein to prevent physical collapse, and fat to keep the mind from deteriorating under long-term stress. And today, I am going to tell you everything many people have never thought about regarding these 3 foods: how to store them properly, the mistakes that make them spoil faster, and why these very ordinary foods once helped millions of people survive wars, economic collapse, and brutal winters. And the further you get into this video, the more important the final item becomes, because many people are underestimating it until life starts becoming truly difficult. Number 1, white rice. The cheapest, most durable, and most reliable calorie foundation for extending survival when the food system starts shaking. The most frightening thing during a crisis is not empty shelves. It is the day you begin looking at food as time. Many Americans today still think they are doing fine. Grocery stores are still open. The lights are still on. Everything on the outside still looks normal. But underneath it all, more and more people feel like life is becoming more fragile than before. Food prices rise while the packages get smaller. A single grocery trip can now leave people standing silently for a few seconds at the checkout line wondering, why did just a few bags cost this much? And that is when people start returning to the foods their ancestors once relied on to survive wars, economic collapse, and long periods of hardship. Rice is one of those foods. The interesting thing is that many people underestimate rice simply because it is too ordinary. It does not come in beautiful packaging. It is not advertised as a superfood. Nobody opens YouTube to watch videos about a bag of white rice. But human history shows something almost completely opposite. The foods that keep people alive the longest are often the most boring ones. During the pandemic, people did not truly panic when snacks disappeared. They panicked when the rice shelves started emptying. And the important detail is this: people were not suddenly buying rice because they loved eating it more. They bought it because deep down, the human brain understands that rice means stability. A large bag of rice is not just food. It is the feeling that you still have time. Time to avoid running to the grocery store in the middle of panic buying. Time to stop watching food prices rise every week. Time to wake up without the feeling that your pantry is slowly running out. That is what many people do not understand about survival. Survival is not just calories. Survival is the ability to extend calmness. And rice does that extremely well. A large bag of rice in the United States usually costs only a few $dozen, yet it can create dozens of meals for an entire family. If it is white rice and stored properly using moisture-proof bags, oxygen absorbers, and sealed food-grade containers, it can last anywhere from 25 to 30 years. Imagine a retired couple after a major storm. The electricity flickers on and off. The nearby grocery store has only a few empty shelves left. Frozen food slowly begins spoiling. But in the corner of their food storage room, they still have a sealed container of white rice packed away years earlier. The man opens the lid, hears the sound of rice pouring into a plastic bucket, and for the first time in days, he no longer feels panic. Not because rice tastes better than steak, but because that container of rice means more time to breathe, more time to stay calm, and more time without having to rush outside into chaos. That is why, for thousands of years, the strongest civilizations in the world, understood its importance very clearly. In ancient China, grain storage was considered almost as important as the military itself. When the rice supply became disrupted, uprisings often followed shortly afterward. In feudal Japan, samurai were once paid in rice. There were regions where rice functioned almost like currency, because when everything else lost value, food still remained valuable. And this is the part worth thinking about. The thing that once helped entire empires survive wars and famine now sits in one of the least noticed corners of the grocery store. No flashy advertising, no tactical packaging, no premium survival branding, just a very ordinary bag of rice. But that ordinariness is exactly what makes it powerful. Because in the end, the human body does not care how attractive the packaging looks. It cares about one thing: what keeps me alive the longest for the least amount of money. And in that sense, rice is almost a monster. That is why many older Americans always keep some rice stored away, even though they would never call themselves preppers. They have lived through inflation, recessions, and difficult times before. They understand that when the economy begins weakening, people almost always return to foundational foods. But what truly makes rice different is not just the calories. It is the feeling it creates. During a prolonged crisis, people do not lose morale only because of hunger. They lose morale because everything around them no longer feels normal. A bowl of hot rice can create an incredibly strong sense of stability. It tells the brain, things have not completely fallen apart yet. There are people who, after a major storm, simply sat watching steam rise from a pot of rice and felt that for the first time in days, they were no longer panicking. That is something many modern survival foods cannot do. A cold protein bar cannot do it. An emergency ration pack cannot do it. Hot rice can. And honestly, rice does something extremely important that most people never notice. It keeps you inside the house longer. During a real crisis, every trip outside to search for food means more fuel, more risk, more stress, and a greater chance of seeing empty shelves. A pantry full of rice creates distance between you and the panic happening outside. That is a massive survival advantage. And here is the part very few people talk about. Rice is actually an anti-luxury food. When the economy starts weakening, the first things that disappear from people's lives are usually steak, restaurants, food delivery, and emotionally driven purchases. But rice stays. Because in the end, people always return to the cheapest food that still provides stability. That is why after every recession, every storm, and every difficult period, people almost always return to rice, soup, and bread. When life becomes unstable, people simplify. And that simplicity almost always ends with rice. But there is something very interesting that many people do not realize. Rice is not actually that delicious by itself. What people truly like is not the taste of rice. It is the feeling of being full. That is why a bowl of hot rice with a little oil, salt, or broth can calm the body down very quickly. The brain responds extremely strongly to the feeling of a full stomach and hot food. In real survival situations, that matters far more than most people think. In many crises across Asia, thin rice porridge was never a symbol of poverty. It was survival mathematics. 1 cup of rice could feed more people when turned into porridge. The calories did not disappear. They were simply stretched with water, heat, and time. That is why during wars and economic collapse, many families survived on large pots of porridge instead of proper meals. But rice also has a dark side when stored incorrectly. Many people buy large bags of rice and leave them in hot or humid places without thinking much about it. Weevils, mold, and moisture can silently destroy an entire container of rice over several months. Some people only discover their pantry has been ruined after hearing faint scratching sounds inside the container late at night. Rodents also love rice. And something very few people know is that rice absorbs odors extremely easily. If stored near gasoline, chemicals, or paint, it can slowly absorb those smells over time. Many older people across Asia have a very unusual habit. They place a few bay leaves inside rice containers. Not for the smell, but because generations before them learned that weevils hate that scent. Some people even place a few whole garlic cloves inside, or freeze rice for several days before long-term storage to kill tiny insect eggs invisible to the naked eye. Tricks like that may sound old-fashioned, until the day you truly need to protect every single calorie inside your pantry. That is why people with real experience do not view food storage as simply throwing supplies into the corner of a house. They see it as protecting their own survival time. Another very important detail is that many people assume brown rice is better because it is healthier. But for long-term storage, white rice is actually the more reliable choice because the oils inside brown rice make it spoil much faster. One very common mistake is placing rice containers directly on concrete floors, inside garages or basements. Temperature changes slowly cause moisture to condense underneath the container over time. Some people only discover the problem when the rice at the bottom begins developing strange smells or changing color. That is why experienced people usually place rice on wooden pallets or shelves instead of directly on the floor. And honestly, the thing that makes rice so powerful is not its shelf life. It is that it almost never betrays people. One thing very few people talk about is that rice absorbs odors extremely easily. If left near gasoline, motor oil, paint, or chemicals inside a garage for too long, it can slowly absorb those smells over time. That is why many longtime preppers treat rice storage almost the same way they treat drinking water: completely dry, sealed, and clean. Frozen food needs electricity. Food delivery apps need functioning systems. Restaurants need a stable economy. Supply chains need fuel and transportation. But rice? It only needs water, heat, and a little time. That is why for thousands of years, after every war, every famine, and every crisis, people have always returned to it. And that is also the most ironic thing about rice. It is so ordinary that people forget how important it truly is, until everything starts shaking. And when that happens, the most boring thing in the pantry often becomes the thing that keeps people alive the longest. Number 2, beans. The cheapest, most stable, and most underestimated source of protein in almost every crisis. A retired man in New Mexico once said he realized everything was changing on the day he stood in front of the beef section longer than usual. He picked up a package of meat, looked at the price, put it back down, and eventually pushed his cart quietly toward the dry beans aisle. Not because he suddenly loved eating beans, but because for the first time in many years, he began looking at food differently. How long can this keep me alive? That is what is quietly happening to many Americans right now. Not panic, not apocalypse, just life slowly becoming more expensive. And when that happens, people almost always return to the most foundational foods. Beans are one of them. If rice buys people time, beans keep the body from collapsing during that time. Calories help you survive. But protein is what keeps the body functioning like a normal human being. Without enough protein, the body starts declining very quickly. More fatigue, more weakness, heavier movement, slower recovery, more mental fog. And this is something many people do not realize. Beans are actually far more nutritious than they appear. 1 cup of cooked beans can contain protein, complex carbohydrates, fiber, iron, magnesium, potassium, folate, and many minerals important for older adults. Especially the fiber in beans helps people stay full much longer. That is why many people feel stable for hours after eating rice and beans, instead of getting hungry again quickly like they do after sugary foods or junk food. The interesting thing is that beans do not just fill the stomach, they help stabilize energy. Many people over 50 begin noticing very clearly that their body reacts differently to ultra-processed food. Blood sugar spikes faster. Fatigue arrives sooner. But beans digest much more slowly, allowing energy to move steadily instead of crashing up and down. That is real survival nutrition. Not flashy, not trendy, but incredibly effective. That is why nearly every culture that has survived long periods of hardship has some version of rice and beans. It is not an accident. It is survival science. During the Great Depression in the United States, soup kitchens almost always relied on beans because they were one of the few protein sources still affordable for working-class families. Cowboys carried dry beans on long journeys because they were cheap, filling, and long-lasting. Even many ancient armies depended on legumes as a critical part of their food supply because meat was extremely difficult to preserve while traveling. The interesting thing is that beans are not sexy. Nobody shows off a pantry full of beans on social media. Nobody creates cinematic advertisements for a bag of pinto beans. Nobody feels rich buying beans. But when life starts becoming difficult, people almost always return to them. Because in the end, survival does not care about what feels exciting. Survival cares about one thing: what keeps the body going at the lowest possible cost. And in the world of protein, beans are almost a monster. A large bag of dry beans in the United States usually costs only a few dollars, yet it can create many meals. If stored properly in a cool, dry, sealed environment, many types of dry beans can last anywhere from 10 to 30 years, depending on the variety and storage method. Think about that for a moment. One of the cheapest protein sources in the grocery store is also one of the most durable. Steak is more expensive. Egg prices constantly fluctuate. Frozen meat depends entirely on electricity. But beans? They almost just sit there, waiting to be used. And this is something many people do not understand. Beans are not just poor people's food. They are the food of people who understand how fragile systems really are. For many years, Americans became used to protein always being available. Chicken nuggets, fast food, frozen meals. But as inflation slowly pushes deeper into everything, many people have started looking at protein differently. They are beginning to realize that meat keeps getting more expensive. Restaurants are becoming harder and harder to justify, and suddenly, beans are returning to the pantries of many families. Not because people suddenly love beans more, but because they need stability more. And here is the extremely interesting part about survival psychology. Beans make people feel like they truly ate. A snack bar can provide calories, but many modern calories fail to create real satisfaction. Beans do. That is why after eating rice and beans, the body usually feels stable much longer compared to junk food. Fuller longer, warmer inside, less energy crashing. Especially for older adults, that becomes very important. Many people over 50 begin noticing clearly that their body reacts differently to ultra-processed food. Blood sugar rises and falls faster. Fatigue arrives earlier. Beans slow energy down. And that becomes extremely valuable during a crisis. What is even more interesting is that rice and beans were almost made for each other. Rice lacks certain amino acids that beans contain. Beans lack certain amino acids that rice helps provide. Combined together, They form a nearly complete protein source. That is why this combination has existed for hundreds of years across so many cultures. Not because of poverty, but because it works. And here is the cold truth. Many modern survival foods are only trying to sell you convenience. But rice and beans? They sell you the ability to keep standing. But just like rice, beans also have a dark side that many people never think about. Dry beans become extremely hard if stored too long or cooked incorrectly. Some people trying survival cooking for the first time are shocked to discover that beans can require a huge amount of fuel to soften properly. And that becomes a very real lesson about preparedness. Simply having food is not enough. You have to know how to use it. That is why many experienced people always soak beans overnight before cooking. It significantly reduces cooking time and saves a tremendous amount of gas or electricity. Some people even add a little baking soda to the soaking water to help soften the beans faster. Another trick many people do not know is to avoid adding salt or tomatoes too early while cooking beans. Acid and salt can harden the outer skin and make the beans take much longer to soften. It sounds minor, but during a prolonged crisis, fuel efficiency becomes almost like survival currency. And this is something many beginners never consider. Beans do not just help stretch food, they help stretch meat. A small amount of beef or chicken may not feed an entire family, but add beans, and suddenly it becomes a large pot of chili capable of feeding people for several days. That is real survival economics. Not glamorous, not cinematic, but extremely practical. Another interesting thing is that beans are incredibly versatile. Chili, soup, stew, rice bowls, burritos, salads, casseroles. Some people even mash beans into spreads when trying to stretch food supplies further. That is why beans appear in so many working-class comfort foods, because they make people feel like they are still eating a real meal. But there is one thing very few people talk about. Bean fatigue. Eating beans continuously for weeks can make people grow intensely tired of them. And that is extremely real survival psychology. During long-term crises, what exhausts many people is not only hunger, but monotony. That is why seasonings matter far more than many people realize. Salt, pepper, garlic powder, broth, cooking oil, dried chili peppers. Those small things help rice and beans remain edible after many weeks. That is why experienced people do not just stockpile calories, they stockpile flavor. But beans also need proper storage. Moisture is their greatest enemy. Beans absorb humidity very easily. If stored incorrectly, they can develop mold or attract insects. That is why experienced people usually use mylar bags, oxygen absorbers, airtight food-grade buckets, and store beans in cool, dark, dry places. One very common mistake is leaving beans inside a hot garage throughout the summer. High temperatures degrade quality much faster than most people realize. Some older beans can become extremely hard and almost impossible to soften even after hours of cooking. And here is something interesting. Experienced people rarely store only one type of bean. They mix different varieties: black beans, pinto beans, lentils, kidney beans, and split peas. Not only because of nutrition, but because variety helps reduce survival fatigue. That is psychology, not just food storage. And in the end, that is what makes beans so powerful. They are not glamorous, not trendy, not exciting, but when everything starts shaking, they almost always remain. Because in the end, survival is not about eating beautifully. It is about keeping the body strong enough to stand up again tomorrow. Number 3, canned sardines. The food that keeps the brain and body from collapsing when stress, exhaustion, and the monotony of crisis drag on for too long. This is where most survival pantries fail. They have rice, beans, flour, oats, instant noodles, crackers, but are almost completely missing essential fats. That is a major problem, because you can survive for a while on carbohydrates, but when the body goes too long without healthy fats, everything starts declining. Brain fog, mood swings, fatigue, inflammation, lower endurance, slower thinking, more physical exhaustion, weaker stress tolerance, and a lingering sense of burnout far longer than most people realize. That is why canned fish matters much more than people think, especially sardines, salmon, and mackerel. Because this is not just protein, this is omega-3 survival food. A man living alone in Louisiana once said the reason he started stockpiling canned fish was not war, not apocalypse. It was after a long hurricane season, when he realized there were days he was simply too exhausted to cook anything at all. The electricity flickered constantly. The refrigerator started warming up. Frozen meat had to be eaten quickly, and the protein section at the grocery store was almost completely empty. But inside his pantry, he still had several dozen cans of sardines and tuna. He said the strangest part was this: the moment he opened a can of fish and ate it with crackers or hot rice, his body immediately started feeling better. Not restaurant good, but for the first time in many days, he felt like he was eating real food again. It sounds small, but that is very real survival psychology. If rice is the calorie foundation and beans are the foundation of endurance, then canned fish is what keeps the body from feeling like it is surviving on starvation food. The interesting thing is that preserved fish was once considered winter survival technology throughout human history. No freezers, no electricity. Yet people still needed protein and fats to survive through winter. Scandinavian countries, fishing villages, World War II ration systems. Many coastal communities survived long winters because of preserved fish. And honestly, sardines were once working-class survival food across Europe. Cheap, filling, high in fat, and shelf-stable. Today, many people complain about the smell of sardines, but in real survival situations, smell does not matter. Nutrition does. An elderly woman in Maine once said that during the hardest years after her husband passed away, she almost always kept a few cans of sardines in her cabinet. Not because she liked them. She openly admitted she hated the smell when opening the can. But she knew that one small can alone could provide protein, healthy fats, and a meal requiring no cooking when snowstorms made it too dangerous to go outside for food. That is something many younger people today do not understand. Real survival food is not the food that tastes the best. It is the food that keeps functioning when life stops functioning normally. One small can of sardines can contain complete protein, omega-3s, vitamin D, calcium, healthy fats, selenium, vitamin B12, and enough calories to keep the body energized far longer than ordinary snacks. Especially for people over 50, that becomes extremely valuable. Omega-3s are strongly connected to memory, focus, mood regulation, and cardiovascular health. The vitamin D and calcium inside whole sardines with bones are especially important for aging joints and bones. And here is something scientifically fascinating. The human brain contains a large amount of fatty acids. When stress drags on for long periods, those fats become incredibly important. Survival is not just about not dying. It is about keeping your mind clear enough to avoid making stupid decisions. And canned fish helps with that, especially when survival diets usually contain far too many carbohydrates. A can of fish in the United States usually costs around $1 to $4 depending on the type. Sardines are usually the cheapest option, yet they are extremely high in omega-3s. Canned salmon costs more, but the protein and fat content are also much stronger. Mackerel usually sits somewhere in the middle, high in fat while still remaining fairly economical when purchased by the case. But the most valuable thing is not the price. It is the fact that it provides complete protein and healthy fats without electricity, without cooking, and with almost no preparation required. Open the lid, and it is ready to eat. In a real crisis, that becomes incredibly powerful, especially on the days when people are simply too exhausted to cook. And this is something many people do not realize. Fat-rich foods almost always become luxury items during prolonged crises, because fat is far harder to preserve than carbohydrates. That is why canned fish becomes extremely valuable. Small, easy to store, ready to eat, and incredibly dense in nutrition. A truck driver in Texas once said he always keeps several cans of mackerel inside his truck cabin after getting stranded for nearly 20 hours during a snowstorm. He said the thing that saved him was not snacks or candy bars. Those only made him hungry again faster. But canned fish kept his body feeling stable much longer. That is the difference between eating to silence cravings and eating so the body can continue functioning. And when people begin getting exhausted from eating only rice and beans, one small can of fish can make the entire meal feel human again. That is the real power of canned fish. Not just keeping you alive, but helping you still feel like a human being. Another interesting thing is that many experienced preppers actually prefer sardines over tuna. Not because they are cheaper, but because sardines usually contain more omega-3s, less mercury, and more calcium. Especially sardines packed in olive oil. That is almost a survival superfood disguised as ordinary food. And here is a very smart, money-saving trick. Do not throw away the oil inside the can. During survival, that is calories. Many people mix that oil into rice or beans to increase calories for the entire meal. Some people use it to coat pasta or dip bread so no energy gets wasted. It sounds small, but during a prolonged crisis, extra fat calories become extremely valuable. Another trick? Buy by the case. Canned fish sold by the case is often dramatically cheaper than buying individual cans. That is why many experienced preppers always wait for sales and buy in bulk instead of purchasing single cans at a time. Some families even follow a simple rule: eat what you store and replace what you eat. They always consume the older cans first and replace them with newer ones, so the pantry stays fresh. That is real pantry discipline, not buying huge amounts and forgetting everything in the corner of the house. As for usage, canned fish is incredibly versatile. Eaten cold, mixed with rice, turned into fish rice porridge, made into fish spread with mustard, eaten with crackers, mixed with beans, added to pasta, made into sandwiches, fish cakes, added to soup, or even mixed into savory oatmeal. Some people even mash sardines with a little lemon juice and black pepper to create a fish spread for bread on days when they do not want to cook anything else. That is real survival cooking. Not beautiful, not fancy, but extremely practical. But canned fish also has a dark side that many people never think about. Its greatest enemy: heat. A hot garage can destroy canned fish faster than most people realize. Long-term high temperatures degrade the oil quality and slowly change the taste. That is why experienced people usually store canned fish in cool, dry, dark places with stable temperatures. One extremely important warning sign: never eat a swollen can. That may be a sign of bacterial growth inside. Other dangerous warning signs include rust, a hissing sound when opened, a sour smell, liquid spraying out. Throw it away immediately. Not maybe it is still okay. Botulism can kill people. That is why good survival food is not simply food with a long shelf life. It is food that gets checked regularly, Most unopened canned fish can last around 3 to 5 years. Some products last even longer if the can remains undamaged and properly stored. But interestingly, many experienced preppers are not obsessed with making food last forever. What they care about more is rotation. Because a real survival pantry is a pantry you actually eat from regularly, not a museum. Another thing very few people talk about is that canned fish also helps reduce survival boredom. After several weeks of eating dry foods and carbohydrates, the body begins craving fats and protein very intensely. That is a natural human response. And sometimes just one small can of fish is enough to completely change an entire meal. One very interesting detail is that smaller fish like sardines are usually safer in terms of mercury compared to larger fish like tuna because they spend less time in the food chain. That is why many experienced preppers prefer rotating different types of canned fish instead of stockpiling only tuna. And perhaps the most thought-provoking part is this. Most real crises do not begin with sirens. They begin with very small moments. Spending a little longer staring at food prices than usual, putting back something you wanted because it suddenly feels too expensive, or opening the refrigerator one day and realizing that everything outside has become far more unpredictable than before. That is why these 3 foods are so powerful. White rice extends time. Beans keep the body standing, and canned sardines keep the mind from declining too quickly under prolonged stress. In the end, preparedness is not about living in fear. Preparedness is about reducing panic when life starts becoming unstable. And sometimes, the feeling of security does not come from having a lot of money. It comes from knowing that inside your kitchen, there is still enough food to take care of your family for a little while longer. If you could choose only one food to begin stockpiling today, which one would you choose?